They don't need to see everything. We'll just do the intro. But it's, today feels like Freaky Friday. Hey everyone, welcome to Friday. I'm Ann, we're in my sewing room again. Today I'm working on a Bernina, and we're using a foot number 3, which could come in a 3 or a 3C format. You'll know which one you need for your machine. Some machines did come with them, lots of machines did not. So we actually have written notes for you. And what we're going to do, it's called gathering over 2 cords. It works like a hot darn, and there's other ways to get there, but we're going to try this foot number 3, show you what it does, and then you probably have a foot or a function on your machine that'll give you about the same thing. So today we're revisiting from Wednesday. We were working on the half and half apron, and half and half meaning half yard or half meter. So that's what you would need to start with. The pattern we're using, it's this one, half and half apron. That's available at the store. We're not covering all the steps and instructions, just some key points and some little tips for some of the fun areas. So Wednesday, in our earlier video, showed you how to do some extra strong pocket corners. They're kind of awesome, and you can use them anywhere that you are going to put a patch pocket. So keep this in your arsenal of interesting tools, how to sew on a pocket for strength and for fun. And it becomes a stitching detail. So we did triangles on Wednesday in the class, but we also showed you another sample where I got jiggy with it and did a different version. Today we're going to gather to put the waistband on. So there's a lot of ways of gathering. There's feet that gather for you. I'm using a foot that was never meant to gather. It's a buttonhole foot, actually, for making manual buttonholes. And I'll show you the difference between this foot and a regular foot, because it's always in the bottom. So the business part of a foot is always on the bottom. And a lot of people look at the top and go, well, they look the same. Often they're very similar looking on top, but the business end of a foot is often on the bottom. And what you can see, this is our basic zigzag foot. So this is flat, has a 5.5 millimeter opening because that's the size machine. And then this foot also 5 millimeter wide opening, but you can see these 2 grooves. They're going to help us with this project. We're going to put a cord underneath the foot. And what happens with that cord, you won't see this when I'm sewing, but you'll get kind of a sneak preview here. Those 2 cords are going to rest, if I get them where they belong, in those grooves, and it's going to hold those straight as they pass through the foot. There we go. And so it'll hold them open and keep them exactly where we want them while we provide a little stitching. And the important part of the stitching is not to stitch into one of the cords. So by trapping them in these little tunnels, it keeps them out of our way. Show you a little close up here. This is what it's going to look like. On the Bernina machine I'm using today, the stitch number is stitch number 12. I'll show you what it looks like without anything in it. There's a quick little stitch out. So what you'll notice is it's got a straight stitch up the middle and then a little zigzag to the right and left, and then another and another. And what it's going to do is that funky cord is going to sit under each one of those zigzags. And the only way, as you can see, to keep that steady is we're going to put them under that foot in those channels, and it's going to hold it exactly where we need it for those 2 zigzags. So I'm going to set myself up So the cord in there is much heavier. This weight is number 3, quite thick and heavy, often referred to as coordinate or gimp thread. And we sell a few versions of that. So if you're worried about it showing somewhere, you can purchase a heavy, strong cord. Now, if that's something you want to try right away and you don't have that, next best, dental floss. Hopefully you have some of that at home. You just need a strong cord, and dental floss works. Of course, as a shop owner, I want you to buy something, but dental floss works. Get myself a piece of that cord. Get the fabric I want to gather. I'm going to put the gathering cord on the back of the fabric. And so I'm just going to fold that cord in half. And you need a good long length of it to get through the gathering. Then you're going to hook that around this little toe on the front end of the foot. Pull it to the back. Put your foot down. And you can see how that's trapped that cord. Then the 2 open ends, we'll leave those to the back. And I would keep the edge of the foot typically on the edge of the fabric so that we can do a seam allowance of 1/2 to 5/8 of an inch. Okay, and we can do a little anchor stitch up the middle there, but then I'm going to switch into that stitch, which on the Bernina is a 12 on several models. But you can see how each zigzag is just popping right on top of the little stitch, but it's not catching it. And that's because the foot is going to hold those cords in place. So, and if you want to take a peek there, you can see it's gathering, but you can hold it, you can push those out if that's inconvenient to you at the time. So it will kind of pull up, and if you don't want it, you can push them out. They just pull out. So we'll do a little couple inches here. And then to remove it, you pull it forward off the foot. The nice thing about this versus other gathering, see there's a loop there. That's not going to pull back. Where often you could pull the tails out of gathering and have to start all over again. So this has got that continuous loop here, so it won't pull back. We don't have to tie it off. And we can move those gathers up and down as much as we want. We can pull this up to a super tight gather. This particular stitch is awesome for fabric that doesn't want to be gathered, like a heavy denim or canvas or something else like that. And it gathers, and it has a nice flat edge here when we go to sew it to something else. So I'm going to sew it back on itself just so you can see it. And with this, the way I stitch today, I can have about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. In the apron pattern we're using today, the next few steps aren't really, there's no seam allowance dictated, unlike some patterns. The important thing is whatever seam allowance you pick is that you're consistent through the project, and a 1/2 inch is perfectly valid here. Or if you're a seamstress or want to be a seamstress, 5/8, or I think that's 1.5 centimeter. That's typically what a seamstress would use, or a sewing pattern would dictate, 5/8 or 1.5. So if we went with that, you can see when I sew straight on here, it'll be well below this mess, and I don't have to pick that out then. Hardest part is just getting up on the bumps. Just take your time and keep your ruffles steady. Keep your seam allowance straight over here. And then we've got a gorgeous ruffle attached to a straight edge. And none of this is showing. And if for any reason you need this out, you can pull it out after. But it can stay in there. It's not going to show on most projects. So it's gorgeous. And it's really an easy thing to stitch. The pattern instructions will tell you how much ruffle to put in the skirt. And you can move these around however you want to. A little bit all across. If you happen to be someone, I'm not sure if they'll be able to see my tummy, but with a full tummy, you might want to put more of the gathers to the middle to help soften that. And if it's not a very wide apron, it's quite a teeny one really. So it doesn't really go around to the hip side. But if you happen to have a bigger curve here, you can put a little more ruffle to there. There is no real firm instruction in this apron pattern about where the ruffles go. So just something to be aware of, the shape that you're going to put this apron on. And I think I'm just going to kind of aim for an overall steady. And these are the two pieces that I cut for the straps. And they're sewn together on a 45. Just something to be aware of. I wiggled it around here and there a little bit. Even though the selvage is showing here and here, they'll be hidden in the seam allowance later. So I'm not too worried about these big ugly white spots. But I managed to sew it as invisibly as possible and not through any polka dots, because you'd be able to see if I had cut them off, and then it would look like a real weird mismatch. So just jiggled that around so the polka dots look continuous, because that actually is the center front and wouldn't want that. If I had been sewing stripes and I did that 45-degree seam there, unfortunately it's really hard to line the stripes up so that they won't look mismatched. So often I would actually ignore the instructions and put a seam in there that had my stripes line up, and then I might have to reinforce that. So when you're pulling on the apron strings, you don't pull that seam apart. Diagonal seam like this is very strong, so when you're yanking on this, it actually doesn't want to pop open. So just some things you need to be aware of. If you're going to join something and there's some stress on it, you want to use that bias joint. However, for aesthetics, I would cheat it on the stripe and I would sew a straight seam. So my stripes lined up and you couldn't see my seam, but I would reinforce that seam. Okay, so I'm going to take the center here and I'm going to take the back of the apron and the front of the strap and sew those together. And my middle is right here on that stripe, and my middle is right here on the waistband. So I'm going to just put a pin there. So I had already measured the ruffle and tied it off so it couldn't grow anymore. Pattern asks you to measure from the middle out and then put the end of the apron there and then make your gathers. And so I've approached it slightly different. So we'll just put a few pins in this so you can see where we're heading. When you're pinning, you try really hard not to stretch anything. And I've just moved a few of the ruffles off of the end here so that this is flat. It'll be much easier to start and stop. And I'll do the same to the other side. just so you know how I anchored this, I tied a knot there. There's just a knot that I tied off in the white section so that I wouldn't accidentally pull this longer. And I can cut that knot out of there if it's lumpy in the seam after. Once this is stitched down, the gathering cord is pointless. There's no need of it anymore. And now the reason we're sewing it what looks like the wrong way around is this step I showed you the other day for hemming the edge, putting, we call it a stay stitch along the edge. I now have that edge that I can fold under. I've done that at a 1/2 inch. And when I'm done sewing, I'll bring this to the front and we'll top stitch that. It'll be gorgeous. It'll be nice and tidy, clean and closed. No one will ever see what we've got going on inside. But this just tells me exactly where I'm going to turn that after. And we'll use that 1/2 inch seam allowance, straight stitch, or actually I'm going to switch to the 5/8. Or no, 1/2. I can get away with 1/2. Few stitches on, a short bar tack, not too much. A lot of people think the more they do, the stronger it is. It's actually the opposite is true. The more you do, the weaker it is. And there's that knot. I'm just going to pull it kind of up and out of the way. Oh. Got a continuous reverse happening. There we go. And all I do is as you're sewing along a ruffle like this, is just pull them straight out. You don't want to let them shift and pull. They will stitch that way and they'll be crooked. And you can see where my needle hits is beyond that ugly white stitch. And that really helps keep it clean. See, I've got a flat spot here. I need to just move a couple ruffles around, and my stiletto's that extra finger. And you can massage these as you go along. And I can hold this actually right past the sewing that I can't do with my finger. Now I have the teeniest finger in the world. And it's just nice to manage the stuff as we go along. And I can hold something all the way through. Don't sew over your pins, no matter what somebody says. Just make those gorgeous as you go along. There we go. Ta-da! Quite lovely. Now, the straps are a bit of a trick. We're going to pull those together, wrong sides together. And we're going to sew that same 1/2 inch seam allowance. But we're only going to sew it to the edge of the apron here. And when we sew it, we want to be careful not to catch any of the apron in there. Right now, these ends are blunt. If you want a point, now would be the time. You could mark it in, sew it, and then cut it after. You can leave them square, whatever makes you happy. It's a design decision now. One angle. It's just straight stitching, so not too fancy. We don't need to worry about it too precise. I don't really need a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the end. So I'm going to just do roughly 1/4 there. Rather than sew it a 1/2 inch and then trim it to 1/4, I'm just going to sew it at 1/4. I forgot a tube turner at home, but we can pretend a little bit here. I can do it with my fingers. It's just not fun. So assuming that was turned all the way out, what we're going to do is we now have that lovely reminder edge stitched in, and we'll pull that down over. You can press it first if you wish. I often don't. I press it to what it needs to be, not what I hope it'll be, or how it I press it as it actually turns out, not as how I hoped it would. And if it makes you happy, put a couple pins in this direction. Oop, throwing pins away now. There we go. What we do then is just top stitch that closed, and your apron will be done. And that would be it. Then with that all tucked in, away we go. So be kind, be calm. Oh, be safe. Be so safe. Take care. Bye, guys.